Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. As we allow more participants to enter the room, but we're very excited to be here today for today's webinar. Today, we're going to be doing the Raschkowan webinar series on gambling in Massachusetts, from table games to sports books. Thank you all so much for joining.
So we'd like to welcome you on behalf of our center at McGill and the National Council on Problem Gambling to the Raschkowan webinar series. And we're really pleased to have with us an internationally renowned speaker who's won many, many awards and has had many accolades from across the globe in terms of her work. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Rachel Volberg. Many of you have heard Rachel speak in the past. She's a sociologist by training and has been involved in gambling research and problem gambling since 1985. That basically means she's been working in the field for over 38 years. Rachel has consulted or directed numerous studies internationally, more than probably anyone else in the field. She's published extensively and has advised governments and private sector organizations on issues relating to gambling legalization, the epidemiology of problem gambling, public policy approaches to developing and refining services for problem gamblers and their families. In addition to her independent consulting firm, Dr. Volberg is currently a research professor at UMass Amherst and is on the faculty of public health and health sciences. In this position, she's become the principal investigator on two huge studies funded by the Massachusetts Gaming Commission, and she's going to talk a little bit about that today. And as Massachusetts is now entering the sports wagering field, it'll be interesting to hear Rachel's opinion. So it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Rachel Volberg.
And I'm so sorry to jump in. Just before we do pass it over to Dr. Volberg, I do just need to do a few introduction slides. So Julie, if you wouldn't mind just advancing. So just to introduce NCBG quickly, we do have our purpose, vision, and mission statements listed. And we do have some upcoming webinars that I just want to introduce. We do have Unveiled Problem Gambling Screening and Assessment eBooks. That will be Tuesday, February 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And as well, we have the NCPG member exclusive Ask an Expert with Honorable Judge Cheryl Moss. That's going to be Gambling Treatment Diversion Courts on Thursday, February 16th, also 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll put the link in the chat. And next slide. I think that's where, we do have we have our special thanks. Just special thanks. This webinar is generously sponsored and presented free of charge by the Norman Raschkowan Foundation and presented in partnership with McGill University's International Center for Youth Gambling Problems and High-Risk Behaviors. Now, I'm so sorry again for the introduction. Thank you so much, both Jeff and
Thanks,
Dr.
Amanda.
Okay, so good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. Or, yeah, it's just noon for me. And I just before I start off on my prepared slides, I just want to thank Jeff and Lynette so much from the bottom of my heart. When that email came through inviting me to do the Raschkowan lecture, I'm like, oh, my favorite people do the Raschkowan lecture, and now I get to do one too. So I really want to thank you both for thinking of me, for inviting me, and for being good friends for the many years that you've been my good friends. And now I guess I'm going to start my slide. No, I guess I need to share my screen. And then I need to start my slideshow. Okay, so it's always a pleasure to be able to talk to people about Massachusetts. I'm very proud of the work that we've been able to do here. But for those of you who are not familiar with what's happening in Massachusetts, 10 years ago in 2013, the Massachusetts Gaming Commission selected my research team to carry out a multidisciplinary, multi-year study of the social and economic impacts of gambling in Massachusetts. And since 2013, the team has been collecting and analyzing a wide array of primary and secondary data to help understand those impacts of gambling expansion. In 2019, the Gaming Commission actually was legally required to re-procure the Sigma study and once again selected our research team to continue it for another 6 years. So we are in business until mid-2025. Some of you may also be aware that in August of 2022, so last year, the Massachusetts legislature legalized sports betting here in Massachusetts at casinos, racetracks, and online. And this topic was also added in the legislation to the Gaming Commission's annual research agenda, which of course put it on our agenda as well. So my focus today is going to be on the social and economic impacts of casino gambling that we have observed in Massachusetts since 2013, and what this may tell us about the introduction of sports betting as that rolls out in the state. So just some disclosures about myself and my work in the gambling studies field. I do, again, want to acknowledge that this study, as well as the other large cohort study that I oversaw, is all been funded by the Massachusetts Gaming Commission. So that's the most important thing about this slide. I want to just give you a sense of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to start by presenting some information about the legalization of casinos in Massachusetts and how the Sigma study actually came about. I'm going to then describe some key features of the study and then provide a look at what we've learned about casino impacts in Massachusetts, and finally consider what we know about gambling in Massachusetts more broadly as legal sports betting rolls out. So way back in 2007, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe received federal recognition and announced its intention to pursue Class 3 gaming, that is casino gaming, under the provisions of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. A year later, in 2008, then Governor Deval Patrick announced that Massachusetts would pass legislation establishing commercial casino gambling. However, as is often the case, it took quite a number of years for a bill to actually be passed. And in addition to the possibility of a tribal casino, the legislators were anxious to recapture the flow of Massachusetts dollars to Connecticut casinos, which in this map are located down here, which was estimated at that time to be about $1 billion per year. By the time the bill passed in 2011, legislators were also grappling with the dire need for jobs in the wake of the Great Recession. And all of those issues really affected the legislation that was passed. So the Expanded Gaming Act passed in November of 2011. It allowed for 3 resort-style casinos to be built, one in each of these very distinct regions of the state. No more than 1 casino could be licensed in each region, but the act also allowed for 1 slot parlor that was not geographically restricted. Coincidentally, or perhaps not so coincidentally, in 2013, one of the small community organizations in Western Massachusetts received funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to conduct a formal health impact assessment to provide input to the Gaming Commission regarding community concerns about a casino in Western Massachusetts. And this slide highlight some of the key concerns that residents of Springfield expressed about the pending introduction of casino gambling in their community. So as I said, recapture of dollars, the need for jobs, but people were very clear about the concerns they had about an increase in problem gambling. And because of the nature of the casino in a downtown urban area, there were quite a lot of people who were concerned about impacts on crime, changes in public safety, and of course, more traffic. So in contrast to many other health impact assessments that have been done around the country, Massachusetts actually had SIGMA in place. And the study provided a unique opportunity to collect and analyze data specifically related to these community concerns and to assess whether those concerns were realized. Now, as I already mentioned, casino legalization took several years to come to fruition in Massachusetts. And one critically important result was that the legislators had time to investigate and identify best practices in the US and internationally related to the introduction of casinos. And there are a number of elements in the Expanded Gaming Act that I believe are particularly important and which I have highlighted in this slide. The most important one, or one of the most important ones, I guess, is that the regulators were given equal responsibility for establishing a viable industry and for minimizing and mitigating any negative impacts. So that gave clear direction to the regulator that negative impacts had to be attended to. Other features are that the host communities were given a strong voice in whether or not to move forward with an application for a license. Problem gambling was framed explicitly through a public health lens. And from my perspective personally, the role of research was central in the legislation, as well as provision was made for funds to carry out the research and to provide services for problem gamblers and their families. So this map shows where the licensed casinos and the slot parlor are located in Massachusetts, along with their host and gaming commissions surrounding communities. So the licensees are Encore Boston Harbor in the Boston region, Region A, MGM Springfield here in Region B, and Plainridge Park Casino, which is the slot parlor, which was built adjacent to a harness racing track in Region A. Now, the three casinos in Massachusetts vary quite dramatically, actually. The first casino that opened in Massachusetts was Plainridge Park Casino in June of 2015. The town of Plainville, where the casino is located, is quite rural, although many people who live in that part of the state commute or once commuted to Boston for work. It's not too bad of a drive, as you can see. So one thing to note about Plainridge Park Casino is that it cost about $250 million to build the casino building and the parking areas adjacent to the harness track. MGM Springfield, as I said, is located in downtown Springfield, which is the largest city in Western Massachusetts. Springfield has a majority-minority population, meaning that the city is primarily African-American and Hispanic. MGM Springfield cost about $1 billion to build. And as I said, it's located right down in the middle of downtown Springfield, and it opened in August of 2018. And then finally, Encore Boston Harbor is the largest casino property in Massachusetts. It's located across the Mystic River from downtown Boston in a mostly industrial community called Everett, where many immigrants live. The casino cost over $2 billion to build, and it opened only in June of 2019. And you may have noticed that I haven't spoken about a casino license in Region C here, and that is because the Gaming Commission has not actually opened a bidding process for that third commercial casino license. So turning now to the SIGMA study itself. The study was originally planned with a pre-post design, where we aimed to assess regional and statewide conditions prior to the casino's opening, then assess conditions after all of the casinos had opened, and finally compare these two snapshots in time to identify the impacts. However, what we didn't anticipate, and I don't think many other people did either, was that it would take 7 years for the casinos in Massachusetts to be licensed, to be built, and to open their doors. And certainly, no one anticipated that a worldwide pandemic would strike just a few months after Encore Boston Harbor finally opened its doors. As in many other jurisdictions, the pandemic dramatically changed people's gambling behavior, as well as the operation of the casinos for well over a year. Most importantly, however, given the passage of time, SIGMA has become much more of a monitoring or a surveillance study, a public health term, surveillance, which many of you are now familiar with because you've been through a pandemic where surveillance was a very important feature of our everyday lives. So this slide just very quickly presents an overview of the social and health impacts that the SIGMA study has been monitoring since it began in 2013. So problem gambling and related indices are important, but we also follow or look at crime. We definitely are interested in population health and demographic impacts, but we also are looking at some environmental impacts as well. Looking on the economic side, these are the impacts that are primarily monetary. Our team looks at direct casino impacts in terms of employment, revenue, and expenditures. They look at information about wages and the communities where the casinos are located in terms of demographic characteristics, but also business activity, real estate and housing, and then government and fiscal impacts. So as I said, the SIGMA study was originally planned to be a 6-year study and to end in 2019, but it was re-procured in 2019, so it's going to be going until 2025. So I've laid these out, the years out here. Across the top are the various activities that we have engaged in over the years. And down on this side, on the right, I have sort of split the study to show you how it developed over a number of phases. Since 2020, this is highlighted in a different color because that's the year we all spent sitting in our houses. But since 2020, the research team has been assessing how to obtain some kinds of primary data in different ways. So what we learned from these two very large surveys here was that it's very expensive and becoming increasingly difficult to conduct high quality general population surveys. And so we've been looking at developing alternatives both for population surveys and for information that we have obtained until quite recently from surveys of patrons at the casinos. So as I mentioned, we carried out a large baseline general population survey in 2013 to assess gambling behavior and problem gambling prevalence before any of the casino licenses were issued. We also completed a baseline online panel survey that allowed us to examine gambling-related harms in much more detail. Once the licenses were issued, which was in late 2014, I believe, we carried out baseline targeted surveys in Plainville and Springfield and their surrounding communities, which allowed us to focus on the local impacts of the introduction of casinos. We didn't have to do a baseline targeted survey in the greater Boston area because we had enough survey participants from that region in the general population survey to allow for comparisons. Between 2016 and 2022, we completed follow-up targeted surveys in Plainville and Springfield. And most recently, we completed a follow-up statewide general population survey and a second online panel survey. And then this bottom panel here just outlines some of the specific community impact, economic impacts that our research team monitors. So this is looking back at some work that we did in 2015 and 2016. We developed profiles, economic profiles of the host and surrounding communities on a range of economic indicators. And in this far right column here, I've provided a comparison to the entire state across all of these measures. So as you can see, Everett and Springfield differ quite a lot from the Plainville area. So wages, annual wages in Plainville are much lower than in either of the other two areas. But this is partly because most of the people who work in Plainville don't actually live there. And many of the people who do live in Plainville work or worked in Boston. Similarly, educational attainment is much lower in Everett and Springfield compared with Plainville, while the poverty rate is actually much higher. Taken together, all of these indicators point to the more precarious character of the Springfield and Everett communities compared with Plainville. Now, this slide presents information about the baseline prevalence rates of gambling participation and problem gambling across the three host and surrounding communities. So Plainville, Everett, and Springfield. And then I've given you the statewide comparison from our baseline general population survey. While the rate of non-gambling is higher in Everett and in Springfield compared to Plainville, it is notable that the rate of at-risk and problem gambling is actually somewhat higher in those two communities compared to Plainville. In gambling research and in research on other addictions, this is commonly known as a bimodal distribution. So while there's less gambling overall in these two communities, those who do gamble are more likely to experience problems related to their gambling. This slide compares some demographic characteristics of at-risk and problem gamblers in the three host and surrounding communities. What you can see here is that the at-risk and problem gamblers in Plainville differ from the larger community only by age and education. So education here and age here. Springfield at-risk and problem gamblers differ from their larger community in terms of gender, age, and education. And then finally, in Everett, at-risk and problem gamblers differ from their community across gender, age, race, ethnicity, education, and income. I'd like to end this part of my talk by identifying some of the things that we have learned about the introduction of casino gambling in Massachusetts. You may recall that some of the biggest issues that concerned people about the introduction of casino gambling in Massachusetts were recapture of money that Massachusetts residents were spending in Connecticut and Rhode Island at those states' casinos, the creation of good quality jobs in the wake of the Great Recession, and possible increases in the rate of problem gambling, crime, and traffic volume. So this slide presents what we have learned to date, or at least through 2019. We've learned that recapture does seem to be working. We've also learned that patrons of the casinos are primarily local or regional, that the number of jobs at the casinos is lower than was projected, but that the quality of the jobs is actually quite good. Not surprisingly, the casinos are providing quite a large amount of government revenue. In terms of participation, casino participation has increased, but it's primarily been due to people adding the local amenity to an existing repertoire of casino patronage. Based on the targeted population surveys that we've done regionally, problem gambling does not seem to have increased in either Region B or Region C, where the slot parlor is located. And we think that this may again be a result of the fact that the population in Massachusetts already, before they had local casinos, they already had quite a high exposure to casino gambling, having been able to travel to Connecticut and Rhode Island to gamble at casinos then, there. The public safety impact reports that the Gaming Commission has compiled over the time that the casinos have been open has found that the casino's effect on crime has been mild, but the increases in traffic collisions and traffic-related calls for services are something that have been identified, although the public safety people basically have argued that these increases are not any greater than they would be if a large shopping mall had opened instead of a casino in downtown Springfield. So now, as you are probably already aware, since I mentioned it already, sports gambling was legalized in Massachusetts in August of 2022. So I want to turn now to describe what we already know about sports betting in Massachusetts, because we've been collecting data on that behavior since 2013. This slide presents some details about the progress towards legalizing sports betting in Massachusetts, along with some details of what was included in our state's legislation. So this first line here is kind of mind-boggling to me, that so many states, more than half, obviously, have legalized sports betting since 2018 when PASPA was overturned. Massachusetts didn't begin a legislative process to legalize sports betting until 2019. And you can see the House bill passed in 2020. There was a Senate bill that finally passed in 2022. They had to be reconciled, and the Governor Baker, finally signed it into law in August of 2022. The legislation in Massachusetts allows for 5 land-based licenses and 7 online licenses. The 5 land-based licenses are limited to the 3 operating casinos and the 2 horse tracks, neither of which has live racing, but they both have simulcast. And then the 7 online licenses are open for competition. The estimates that I've seen are that annual revenues from sports betting in Massachusetts, the most optimistic scenario is that the activity will generate about $60 million in annual tax revenues. And the legislation is quite similar to the Expanded Gaming Act, which legalized casinos in terms of the consumer protection measures that are built in. From my perspective, perhaps most importantly, there is research required in the sports betting bill. And Section 23 in the bill actually says that it identifies some very specific sports betting questions that the Gaming Commission is required to investigate. There are some self-exclusion provisions, as I mentioned, in terms of consumer protection. But as we know, there are also some new populations that are at risk when it comes to sports betting. So in hopes of helping people sort of organize their thoughts, I wanted to just lay out here sort of the history of the survey research that has been conducted in Massachusetts since 2013. So I've already mentioned the baseline general population survey. This was the sample size, and this is when the survey was carried out. The same time period, we carried out the online panel survey with, again, quite a large sample. The targeted surveys, the baseline targeted survey in Plainville was carried out in 2016. And then, I'm sorry, these are the follow-up targeted surveys. The one in Plainville was 2016, and the one in Springfield was 2019. They were planned for 1 year after the casinos in those communities opened. In 2022, we finally were able to conduct a follow-up online panel survey and a follow-up general population survey. The plan had originally been to do both of these surveys in 2020, but that didn't work out. And then there was some other delays that led to these two surveys not happening until 2022. And then finally, as I mentioned briefly at the beginning of my talk, the Massachusetts Gambling Impact Cohort, or MAGIC study, we conducted 5 assessments with these 3,000 individuals, the same individuals over all of this time between 2013 and 2019. So in practical terms, what this means is that we actually have a lot of information about sports betting behavior in Massachusetts prior to 2018, when PASPA was overturned. Now, only the 2 population surveys actually yield data that is representative of the adult population of Massachusetts. But the online panel surveys and the MAGIC cohort study provide important clues to what's been happening with sports betting in Massachusetts since 2013. So this first graph is from the baseline general population survey. It's weighted, so it is representative of the population. And it shows the frequency of past year participation in different types of gambling in Massachusetts in 2013, 2014. You can see that lottery was the most popular form of gambling, followed by raffles, followed by casino gambling, which all would have been out of state because there were no legal casinos in Massachusetts in 2013. Now, although sports betting was illegal in Massachusetts at that time, the past year rate of sports betting in that time was 12.6%. And the people who said that they had bet on sports in the past year, when we asked them in 2013, 2014, were twice as likely to be men. They were more likely to be adults aged 25 to 54 than they were to be older, 65 plus. They tended to be better educated than many people in the population, but they were less likely to have graduate degrees or doctoral or professional degrees. And they were more likely to have annual incomes of 100,000 or more compared to 50,000 or less. So not surprisingly, what we know about sports bettors is that they tend to be male, they tend to be younger, they tend to have relatively good levels of or relatively high levels of education and income. This table presents information about gambling participation from the general population survey compared with the online panel survey. So this data is unweighted, and so it's not representative of the population, but it is interesting to compare the general population behavior with the behavior of the online panel survey. So it shows that past year participation in various gambling formats was higher among the online panel respondents compared with the general population for every type of gambling except raffles. Now, this is entirely to be expected. Online panels are known to include large numbers of heavy gamblers. But what this shows is that even in 2013, 2014, the rate of sports betting, again, was not insignificant. This table is a comparison between the baseline online panel survey, which was carried out in 2013 and 2014, and the follow-up online panel survey, which was completed in April of 2022. And what you can see here is that the rate of sports betting was significantly higher in 2022, while the rate of disordered gambling, or the most severe end of the category, was also significantly higher in 2022 compared with 2013. Now, again, these data are not generalizable to the population, but they are an indication that there has been some change in sports betting behavior and potentially in problem gambling rates in between those two time periods. We know that because legal daily fantasy sports was introduced in Massachusetts in 2016, some of the difference in this participation rate may reflect that change in the legal gambling landscape. But the question of whether these differences are real or artifactual will not be answered until we finish our analysis of the follow-up general population survey data, which we're in the middle of doing right now. And finally, some information from the cohort study, which I find particularly interesting. So this is data on monthly gambling participation across the 5 waves, 2013, 2015, 16, 18, and 19 of the cohort study that was carried out in that period of time. So this is not representative of the population, it's unweighted, but the results provide some interesting insight into changes in gambling behavior among members of the cohort over this time period. So although we started with a cohort of just over 3,000 individuals who were selected from the baseline general population survey and stratified by risky gambling behavior, this chart is based only on the 2,000 or so individuals who we had information from all 5 assessments. So what this slide shows is that lottery participation has been quite stable over time, as has sports betting, pretty stable over time. Out-of-state casino gambling dropped quite significantly in 2016, which is when about a year after Plain Ridge Park Casino, the slot parlor, had opened and continued to decline. And obviously, there was no Massachusetts casinos in 2013 or 2015. By 2016, we were seeing quite a jump in gambling at a Massachusetts casino, particularly after the opening in 2018 of the MGM Springfield Casino. And then finally, looking at online gambling, this jump here really occurred in 2016 when daily fantasy sports were legalized. So this slide and the next one really summarize the economic and social impacts of sports betting that have been identified to date in the scholarly literature. So this is not from our survey data, but this is from a scan of the literature. The economic impacts identified to date have been mixed. So there's some evidence of substitution, which is especially impactful for lotteries in the jurisdictions where sports betting has been introduced. There is a notable lack of research actually on any other impacts, economic impacts of sports betting. And in discussions with our economics team at Sigma, they identified a number of really critical economic issues, including job creation, recapture of gambling dollars from illegal sports betting markets or from neighboring jurisdictions. And then on the social side, we've concluded that there is a significant potential for economic harm if sports betting causes high rates of problem gambling, or if a significant portion of revenue from sports betting operations leaves Massachusetts. In other words, if operators are from other jurisdictions and take the bulk of their revenues that out of Massachusetts. In the social research on problem gambling, there has literally been a very singular focus. I was not able to find more than just a couple of articles that looked at social impacts apart from problem gambling. So, as I mentioned, in Massachusetts as well as nationally, sports betting is popular in most demographic groups, but appeals most to young, well-educated men. There is evidence, not just in Massachusetts, but nationally, based on the Engage surveys, that sports betting participation has increased since 2018. And again, based on the Engage surveys, there does seem to be some evidence of an increase in gambling harms. But I want to caveat that by saying that although problem gambling prevalence is higher among sports bettors, it's primarily because sports bettors tend to be involved with a number of gambling activities. And it's not just the sports betting by itself that is the only risky form of gambling. So we concluded that legalized sports betting in Massachusetts does have the potential to increase rates of gambling harm and problem gambling, but it probably is going to be fairly modest because the rate of sports betting already is happening in Massachusetts. So these were some of the conclusions that we presented to the Gaming Commission late last year as they were ramping up to deal with sports betting and to regulate it. We noted that the maximum economic benefits for Massachusetts will depend on Massachusetts sports betting licensees capturing a substantial proportion of the illegal sports betting market. We noted that there was also some potential for job creation, especially in the tech sector, since online sports books, are technology jobs. And of course, there's potential for tax revenue. There is a significantly higher rate of problem and at-risk gambling among sports bettors in Massachusetts. This is based on all of our Sigma data. But as I said, the relationship between sports betting and gambling problems is not straightforward. And that's because sports bettors tend to engage with multiple types of gambling, and all of these are likely to contribute to their problems. Now, that said, there are groups in the population that are of particular concern as state-sanctioned sports betting becomes available in Massachusetts, which it did on Tuesday in the casinos. And those groups are groups that have not previously been involved in sports betting. So adolescents are going to be very interested in sports betting because that's something that is being advertised heavily, especially to young men, young and emerging adults. So that's individuals aged 18 to 24 generally. And again, this is a group that is just making the transition to being able to gamble legally, and that lack of experience clearly is a cause for concern when it comes to getting into difficulties. Women, we know that the sports betting industry is marketing heavily to women at this point. The quote I saw was that they're trying to grow the market, I guess. And as a previously unexposed group or uninvolved group, again, women are likely to be somewhat more at risk. Similarly with immigrants, college athletes, we believe are at risk because of sort of the milieu in which they operate. And then finally, individuals in recovery from gambling problems. We know that the strongest predictor of developing a gambling problem is having had a problem in the past. And the excitement and amount of attention that sports betting is getting in Massachusetts right now is more than likely giving some individuals who are in recovery difficulties and making it more likely that they might have a relapse going forward. So I probably have been talking way too fast, but hopefully some of you have some questions. And if you want more information about any of the numbers that I have slammed into your brains, you can find more information at our website here.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel, for your very comprehensive review of what's been happening in the state of Massachusetts, which is parallels many other states as they move towards changes in gambling regulation, different types of gambling, and in particularly in sports wagering. I do have I'll ask everyone, if you have any questions you'd like to ask, to please put those in the chat box and I'll relay those to Dr. Volberg. I have a question, Rachel. I mean, do you think sports wagering is just going to be a blip in terms of the number of people with problem gambling, and that will actually level off at some point, or will this be more continuous? The other thing around sports wagering has changed dramatically since I was a young man. We used to wager on whether a team was going to win or not win. And today there are multiple types of gambling activities you could do within sports wagering. And so I'm concerned about individuals who look at chasing their losses within a game, not just necessarily following up that. So do you think this will be a blip, or do you think this is going to be a continuous growth?
Well, I think it's going to be somewhere in between that, Jeff. I think a blip sort of means it goes up and then it goes down. And I don't think it's going to do that. But I also don't think it's on like any kind of a logarithmic increase. What we've seen with a variety of gambling introductions over the far too many years that I've been doing gambling research is that when you first introduce a new form of gambling in a jurisdiction, you do see an increase in the rate of problem gambling, but that tends to modulate over time, as does gambling participation. And, you know, living in a school of public health with a bunch of epidemiologists, gambling and gambling problems tend to look very similar to any other epidemiologic curve, where you see an increase at the beginning because you have vulnerable groups in the population that are not immunized or, you know, haven't been exposed. You see an increase at the beginning, and that tapers off after a while and comes back down as people develop immunity, either through having experienced a problem with their gambling, or leaving the jurisdiction potentially and taking themselves out of the population in one way or another. So I think it's going to be at least several years. You know, we've been rolling out sports betting in the United States since 2018. So, you know, I think it's likely to continue increasing for some number of years, but then it's going to moderate. The challenge, I think, is that while you're waiting for the population to become immunized, you've got a lot of harm that's happening, right, that may not rise to the level of a gambling disorder, but nevertheless is very impactful on individuals, families, and communities. So that speaks to the first part of your question. The second issue that you raised was the speed of the gambling activity. And there's been some very interesting research that was done quite some time ago about structural characteristics. And the question at that time was, why are slot machines so much riskier than other forms of gambling? And one of the answers was the frequency issue, you know, that there were so many opportunities that people were given to make a bet in a given gambling session. And I think, sports wagering does seem to be following that particular trajectory of offering more and more opportunities to make a bet within a single gambling session. And so I think that is a major issue of concern, and I think merits quite a lot of further research.
Yeah, Mark Griffiths has talked about it going from a discontinuous form of gambling to a continuous form of gambling. And so that raises a number of questions. I have one more question, and then I'll get to the chat questions. In your cohort study where you showed not much change over the 5 years in terms of sports wagering, that was both males and females. Am I correct? If you looked at it by gender, would you have seen an increase, number one? Number two, that cohort study that you reported the data on stopped in 2019, and that's when sports stopped around the world because of COVID. So I wonder if you look at the data again by gender, in 2020, 2021, 2022, if we wouldn't see an actual increase.
Yeah, that's an interesting analysis. I'm going to have to talk to our data person about giving me a gender breakdown on the magic on the cohort data. We did not look at it separately by gender, so that's an interesting question that I hopefully can answer soon. Sadly, the cohort study is no longer operating, so we're not going to have any cohort data after 2019. It would have been amazing to have been able to, conduct assessments through the cohort, through the COVID lockdown, and then post-COVID, as things have opened up, how has people's gambling behavior changed again? Once they're sort of the types of gambling that they like to do in person are available. So, but we're looking at some different ways to try to collect data on a more regular basis. So it's not going to be the power of the cohort is that you're following the same individuals over time.
Right.
But we are looking at some viable alternatives to conducting large-scale general population surveys, which are very expensive and increasingly challenged by low response rates.
Yeah.
Dr.
Well, thank
Volberg,
you.
oh, I'm sorry. There were two questions just about the demographics of the cohort. The first being, did the study include any data on Black women who were also experiencing problem gambling?
So I can't tell you the actual numbers of Black women that we had in the cohort. I can tell you that the cohort, or the original cohort, was stratified. So we over-selected for people who, in the baseline general population survey, indicated that they gambled in ways that put them at risk. So anyone who was classified as a problem gambler in our baseline study was invited to join the cohort. Anybody who is an at-risk gambler. But then we also over-selected for people who gambled heavily, either in terms of the number of activities they did or the amount of money that they spent. So half of the cohort was actually these high-risk people, and then the other half of the cohort was just, a random selection of people from our sample. And we have we have a final report that lists out the demographics of the members of the cohort. And I'm sorry, I did not revisit that before I started this lecture, but that report is available on our website, and I encourage the person who raised the question to take a look at that report.
Perfect.
Well, thanks, Rachel. We have a lot of positive comments and about your workshop, and also the timeliness of the information you presented. Somebody asked a question whether or not you have any information about veterans and sports wagering.
We actually over-selected in. So back to the beginning, the baseline general population survey, the results were very interesting in terms of veterans. They had a much higher problem gambling prevalence rate than others in the sample. And so we actually pulled those respondents out and did some separate analyses on them. My student, Josh Freeman, and I and another colleague actually published a paper on the veterans subsample. I am blanking on the results, of course, because I never remember a paper after I've written it, and it's, like in the rearview mirror. But again, that publication is available. It's open access, and a link to it is posted on our website. So again, I would encourage your questioner to look for that paper and Obviously, if you have questions after you've read the paper, reach out to me. I'm at rvolberg@umass.edu.
Well, I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions being forwarded to you, Rachel. We've run out of time, but thank you so much for participating in the Raschkowan Lecture Series, for a great informative talk and a sharing of your knowledge and expertise in the field. I know you continue to make many advances both in the field and in terms of public health and legislation. So I want to thank you for that. I want to remind people that the next lecture in the Raschkowan series will be on March 2nd by Dan King, who's in Adelaide in Australia. And so we would welcome everyone to sign on with the NCPG, and we'll be making an announcement shortly. But again, on behalf of everyone, Rachel, it's always a pleasure to hear some of your new informative research. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much for inviting me and being a good friend all these years.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Okay. Have a good afternoon or morning if that's where you are.